Shri stop, and again, you have
yes, 40
there's a long lunch break, so if you
okay.
go a little beyond sort of 12, 10, 12, 15.
I think it'll go faster. These are some, maybe this is less tangible to the broad audience. But okay, so the next thing, so we're going to now move from human decision making to motor control. Okay, so how we generate movements, how we build models in terms of trying to understand which brain regions are controlling movements and how and so forth. And actually, this was work done primarily by PhD student Shreya Saxena, who's now a postdoc at Columbia University. So Shreya was my master's student at Hopkins in biomedical engineering, and then she went to work with actually Munzer Dale at MIT to do her PhD. And this talk is really about her PhD work. So actually, Munzer had much more of a contribution in this work than I did, but he's not talking about neuroscience, so I'm going to present this for him. But if you like the work, that's, you can, attribute that to me. If you have, issues or things, you can go to him and talk to him. Okay. All right, so performance limitations. So this is going to be about using another phenomenological type of model to try to quantify trade-offs between neural computing and accuracy when it comes to tracking fast movements. Okay? So when you think about tracking fast movements in particular, this is a very valuable skill. And in the animal kingdom, it might even dictate your survival, right? So think of a predator chasing a prey, like a cheetah chasing a gazelle. What does the cheetah have to do? Well, it has to track a very fast-moving object that's going zigzagging right and left. And whether the cheetah succeeds depends on two big factors. Okay, so this is the sensory motor control system that's allowing the cheetah to move in that way, okay, to chase its predator. And the two factors, clearly how fast it can move and whether it tracks the gazelle, depends at least on the brain, so how efficient your brain is computing the actions you want to take, and how quickly your muscles are able to react to that, receiving commands from the brain, okay? So obvious, this is very obvious, okay? But what we're going to be interested in is what the study was really about is coming up with more of a quantification of that, right? So how is it that the brain and the muscles are interacting that ultimately govern or limit your performance, okay? So that's what we're going to try to answer. That's what Shreya set out to answer. So in this particular study, they focused on periodic signals, so just tracking sinusoids. I came in too late last night to get the demo working, but just pretend there's a live demo here. So say you're a subject, and I ask you see a computer screen in front of you, and you can control a cursor. And on the screen, you see these dashes that are moving from right to left. So just imagine that these dashes are moving from right to left, and your task is to move the cursor up and down. So you need to touch, as these dashes are moving from left to right, you need to touch every bar in a periodic motion, okay? So this is like tracking a periodic signal. Now, if they're moving slowly, and this is actually an example, maybe Munzer did this, I don't know, you can actually track pretty well if they move slow enough, right? And you can start increasing the speed, and at some point, it's going to be so fast that you actually don't do very well in terms of tracking. You actually exhibit various undesirable phenomena. So you might overshoot. In some cases, you might undershoot. But in particular, most of the time you skip cycles, right? If these things are going much faster and you're trying to do this, you're going to miss several of those dashes, okay? And those are called skip cycles, okay? So ultimately, you can track, but then there's a cutoff. There's a limit above which you can no longer track accurately. There's a lot of experiments done that in humans and in monkeys that show the same undesirable effects as you demand more and more tracking of higher and higher frequencies. So on the left, you have a very, very old study where patients were asked to trace this sinusoidal curve, okay? So it's kind of like that demo I showed you where you're trying to accurately track the sinusoid. But as you're demanding more and more strokes per minute, so higher and higher frequency, you can see that the tracking performance degrades here. So this is a human study. This is a monkey study looking at saccades. So the monkeys were trained to move their eyes, saccade, up and down to track those dashes, okay? And again, as the frequency increases, the performance of the monkey decreases. And in fact, you see the same types of undesirable phenomena, overshoot, undershoot, and skip cycles. And in particular, it appears that you're increasing your frequency of the reference signal that you're trying to track, but then there seems to be this cutoff above which all of these bad things can happen. Okay? So our hypothesis is there exists this cutoff frequency, okay, where one may actually skip cycles. So this entire study was about proving that this exists and actually computing it. You can think of this kind of like the bandwidth of a sensory motor control system, right? And we know that this bandwidth, this cutoff frequency, depends on your brain dynamics, neural dynamics, how quickly you can process signals, as well as your muscles. Yeah? And so what she set out to do is actually quantify omega C and write it down as a function of these two different components. So to test this hypothesis, we need a model of the sensory motor control system. So before I draw the block diagram, I want to motivate it. So again, this is a very simplistic introduction to sensory motor control. So suppose I'm considering an arm reaching motion. So I want to move or reach to a target. Okay. So what happens? I see a target and I have this goal to go reach for it. Okay. That information is sort of encoded in the parietal region of the brain, which communicates to motor regions, motor cortex, primary motor cortex, which is symbolized by M1, premotor, supplementary motor. These are the motor areas of your brain that are translating your goals into motor commands that then come down through the brainstem, down through the spinal cord. So it's called a corticospinal tract. So there's a direct projection that goes down your spinal cord. It innervates neurons, the final neurons, which are called alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord, which then innervate the muscles, okay? And you innervate the agonist and antagonist muscle in such a way that you can achieve your goal. Now, as you're moving, there's feedback coming back to you, right? There's the visual feedback. You can see how you're doing. Are you getting close to your target? Are you not? As well as what's called proprioceptive feedback, where the muscles send back signals back through cerebellum in particular, back to the motor regions to sort of correct for any errors, okay? So you can sort of write this down simplistically in this block diagram. So I have some reference signal, in our case it's going to be sinusoid signal, that I want to track at the output, so this is my movement. That information hits the motor regions of the brain, as well as cerebellar, goes down the spinal cord, hits the alpha motor neuron, and as we talked about in the very first lecture, how do neurons communicate? Through spike trains. So spike trains come in and innervate your muscles, your spindles and so forth. You move, and then you have the visual proprioceptive feedback, goes through cerebellum, and I'm kind of lumping brain into this box, spinal cord into this box, muscles here, and then feedback is going to be some sort of model, okay? Question? Yeah. So, good. Okay, so we don't specifically address how omega C changes with fatigue or anything, but we will talk about how omega C depends on how your brain computes, okay, and how your muscles work and so forth in terms of the dynamics, as well as feedback. So I'm going to actually talk about the sensitivity of omega C with respect of these various components of the sensory motor control system, okay? Okay, so what do we want? So I need a model so that I can compute this omega C, okay? But we also want a model that actually can generate the phenomena we observe, okay? So we know that I want a model that if I put in a sinusoid, I generate a sinusoid, I get out a sinusoid, and I want to make sure that that model, when the frequency of the sinusoid is low, I want to make sure I track. And when the frequency is too high, I want to see those skip cycles, right? I want to make sure I see overshoots, undershoots. So I need the model to at least reproduce those observations. Of course, we're going to want more out of the model, okay? So again, since we're trying to characterize omega C as a function of these components, I need a tractable model that I can analyze. So what if you just start linear? What if every block here was linear time invariant? What does that mean? Well, first of all, these aren't pulses anymore. Let's just say if I want everything to be continuous valued signals in this loop, instead of sort of modeling the spikes coming out of the alpha motor neurons as a spike train, let me just average and look at average firing rates. Okay, so now that's how I turn that into a continuous signal. So everything is LTI and continuous. Now, if that were the case, I know that if I put in a sinusoid into this simple LTI system, I'm going to get out a sinusoid. And the only thing, in fact, if I have one frequency in my input, I'm going to get the same frequency because everything's linear. And the only thing that's potentially going to change is the gain, the amplitude of the sinusoid, and maybe a phase shift. Okay, very simple. So clearly that's not going to work, right? I'm not going to get those skip cycles with a pure linear model. So unfortunately, that's not going to work for me. Okay, so I still want something tractable. So what Shreya and Munzer did is like, okay, let's try to keep as much as we can linear in this model and only make the smallest change so that I get the observed phenomena, because I want to maintain tractability of the analysis. So let's go back and adhere to the actual biology, the biophysics, and say, okay, everything can be linear, but what comes out of the alpha motor neurons is not. Okay, I still want to adhere to this pulsatile control. I want spikes to innervate the muscles, but everything else around it can be linear. And the hypothesis is if just that small change, I might be able to reproduce the phenomena in the slow and the fast regimes. And so what she did here, I'm going to go a little bit into the blocks, is she used what's called a simple integrate and fire model of a neuron. So remember the neuron we talked about in the beginning. It receives some excitation. The voltage across the membrane changes, and if it changes to be large enough of a difference, the neuron will actually fire an action potential. Okay? So the simplest sort of mechanistic like model of a neuron is to say, okay, it's receiving an input, a stimulus, and it's going to integrate that input. Okay? And then only when that integral has crossed a threshold, let's say Q, it fires a spike and resets. Okay? So this is called integrate, fire. Integrate, fire. It's the simplest model of a neuron that sort of adheres to the sort of mechanistic. Okay? So she uses these integrate and fire neuron models for the alpha motor neurons. She has sort of, again, from a model point of view, she splits it into two types. Spike, a neuron model that's going to innervate the agonist muscles, and another spike train that innervates the antagonist muscle. And that way I can get this motion from my muscle model, okay? And just, again, conceptually, she says she allows the spike train to be negative, okay, that are going to excite the antagonist, and positive spike train for the agonist. The simple integrate and fire type model. So for the rest, though, I just want to mention what she did here. So what about these other blocks? Cerebrocerebellar, you're lumping the entire brain into this simple system, okay? Well, she didn't pick this arbitrarily. Even though it's LTI, she did go back into the literature to see, well, what do we know? What have people used and validated in terms of modeling how motor cortex responds to input? Well, there's a lot of literature that essentially from a conceptual firing rate standpoint, the motor cortex is simply applying sort of just integrating and scaling. And then there's another body of work, really nice work done actually by another former student of Professor Dolly maybe 20 years ago, Dr. Steve Massaquoi, who showed that actually the cerebellum is nothing but a PID controller, proportion. So it has a scaling component, it integrates, and it can take derivatives of its input. So using that information, she sort of lumped the two and said, those are my cerebrocerebral dynamics. I have these unknown parameters, these gains, but it's simple LTI. Similarly on the muscle, so there's her integrate and fire. So she's integrating. If it crosses the threshold, it generates a spike and resets. And in the muscle, she uses a simple linear lumped model of a muscle where the muscle stiffness is just modeled as a gain, and the muscle viscosity is like a leaky integrator. Okay, again, plenty of studies have used these simple models to represent muscle dynamics. Okay, and then the feedback, I think she just stuck with a gain. Okay, feedback. So very, very simplistic model of the sensory motor control system, but again, it seems to be appropriate for the question she's after, which is, can I analytically compute this omega C? Okay, this cutoff frequency above which you say skip cycles. So when she took that model and she put in some sort of standard parameters in each of those blocks, she can simulate, okay? She can put in a sinusoid at the input and every block will respond, and she can read off the spike trains coming out of her alpha motor neuron model. She can look at the output of her model. And when she compares model simulation to actual data recorded from human, you tend to at least see qualitatively similar phenomena, right? This is the spiking activity of the alpha motor neuron, which seems to be very active during these peaks, just like shown in her model. And then, of course, as you increase the frequency of the input, both the model and the data show this undesirable phenomena, okay? So you get those skip cycles. So the model seems good enough, but actually it's not good enough for the neuroscience community, okay? So one of her advisors on her thesis committee, Emery Brown, is in the neuroscience, and he was like, well, this is such a simplistic model. Of course, nobody's going to believe in it as a neuroscientist. There's nothing realistic about it. Okay, fine, you have an integrate and fire model. The only way you can convince them, however, is to show that the model reproduces experimental data in all these other conditions. Okay, so she went through, I'm not going to walk you through all of this, but she went through this very detailed sort of literature review of trying to understand, what types of experiments have been done to study sensory motor control, reaching movement in both health and disease. She compares data to model in all these different conditions, and is showing that qualitatively you can reproduce a variety of things observed experimentally. And that was really critical for her, for people to accept this model. In this part, which part of the brain? So in her model, okay, so when you're doing sensory motor control, okay, again, there's so much is involved. Your vision, your everything, okay? But simplistically, you can think of it as in your brain, you have regions of the brain in the cortex called motor regions. So these are very specific structures that have been isolated and shown to be highly correlated to movement generation. So you have a region of the brain that's around here that's called primary motor cortex. And if you look at neurons and neural activity in that region of the brain, they highly correlate to behavior that you measure. Okay, so there's certain structures that clearly command movement and also receive feedback signals. And what she's doing in her model, she's only using basically modeling primary motor cortex, cerebellum. That's it. That's her model of the brain. Okay, but it's enough to get her to a point where she can start looking at this cutoff frequency. Right here. It's not in one particular lobe. It's in, you have it as part of frontal, parietal. It kind of crosses lobes, but right around here. Yeah. Sorry, the what? Sorry. Oh, it may not. It's not something that's deterministic, right? So if you're actually playing this, imagine you trying to track a very fast signal. You're going to skip cycles, but there's not necessarily a deterministic way to predict. I mean, something that I can predict. It depends on what's happening. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, this is not something she's addressed at all. I think the model is just trying to track an input, right? It's not going to ignore everything and just say, I don't care about anything. I'm going to make a very deterministic, predetermined motion, is what I think you're getting at. Her model assumes you are responding to a command. Yeah. Yeah, it will, yes, her model, so if you put in a sinusoid that say starts at a low frequency, increases, decreases, yeah, so she's able to reproduce the phenomenon. Right, I mean, so there's a limit to how fast you can track, right? Just think about it. There's a limit to what you can do. Maybe what you're getting at is, okay, then just stay put. It depends. I mean, if you want to minimize your tracking error, maybe just staying, idle might be the best thing to do. But that's not what this model is trying to predict. It's just saying, yeah. No, they are trying to earnestly track. They're not trying to, minimize an error or something like that. They're honestly trying to track because that's what they're told to do. They're instructed. A lot of these experiments, people tell them what they want the subjects to do. Yes. What's not very clear? Here? In the data or in the model? So the model, what's hard to see here, the black dashes, that's the reference signal. So it's very high frequency. And look at her blue. She's not able to track that. She's skipping several cycles. Yeah, sorry. Okay? Okay. So once she validated the model and showed that it reproduced all these phenomena, she can now go back and answer that question. Okay, now that you believe in the model, let me see if I can compute this omega c as a function of these different components. Okay? So how did she do that? Well, I'm not going to go through the details, but I want to give you a conceptual walkthrough of how she did this. Okay, so the first thing she recognizes, okay, there's only one problematic component in this entire closed loop system. It's this nonlinearity that comes from the integrate and fire. So she calls that ENSA bar, right? So this whole piece here is an integrate and fire. So you're integrating some input, and then that passes through a nonlinearity. So the input is y, and the output of the nonlinearity is u tilde. And essentially what's happening is y increases, u tilde is not changing, okay? It's sort of constant until you've crossed some threshold q. Once you cross, y crosses that threshold q, it jumps, okay? And the output of the nonlinearity jumps. When you take a derivative of that jump, you get this Dirac delta, right? So she gets a spike and it resets. So this is how you can model the integrate and fire, okay, from the nonlinearity. So, but then when she says that, okay, this is the only problematic, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just change the viewpoint. I have this problematic nonlinear component, and then I want to see what the rest of the system looks like from the viewpoint of the nonlinearity. And that system, we call it G. That's entirely LTI, linear time invariant, right? So G has two inputs, U and R, and two outputs, Z and Y, and the nonlinearity is as you see. Now, because this is LTI, you can write down a state space model. I think these are her slides. She's missing her output Z here. But it's essentially you get this nice LTI state space model. And the U of T is a spike train, right? So either it's 0 most of the time, or it jumps and has a spike with length Q, positive Q, or it's a negative spike, negative Q. So that's what U of T looks like. Okay, and so if U of T is 0, okay, which most of the time you have this nice linear system, but then you're kind of switching depending on when spikes are happening. So in order to answer the question of what's that cutoff frequency, so one thing before I go into how she did this is think of Q. Q is the parameter in your alpha motor neuron model, right? So what happens if Q is high? If Q is high, you're going to see less sparser spiking, because it takes longer to integrate in order to generate the spike, right? So actually, that's a very sparse sampler. Whereas when Q is low, you get a lot more spikes. So sort of conceptually, you should think that, okay, the bandwidth should increase as Q goes down, right? I should be able to track faster changing inputs when Q is low. So the way she tries to get at computing this cutoff, the way I like to think of it is I start from the output of the system. So I want Z to be a sinusoidal signal that has the same frequency as the input R, okay? So think of Z of T as this red sinusoidal input. How do I generate a sinusoidal input that comes out of an LTI system whose inputs are spikes? How do you do that? Well, you do that if you get this particular spike train. So you have a sequence of positive spikes going in, okay? And that's going to generate this peak, followed by negative spikes, followed by positive, followed by negative, right? So you have this bursts of positive and negative spikes. And if you put that input into M, an LTI system, you will get a sinusoid. So in order to track my input with some frequency, I need to analyze the switching period of these bunches of spikes, right? And so what she does is she finds a way to characterize that switching period and how that changes. okay, over time. And she compares that switching period to the frequency of the input. And right through that direct comparison, she can say, okay, if the switching period is too slow, you're going to skip cycles, otherwise you won't. Okay, so it's a sufficient condition, and she can actually compute omega C as a function of all the parameters in the model, but she has to solve an optimization problem. It's not a closed form solution, okay? But you can compute it given any model parameter. So basically she found that if your frequency of the input is greater than this cutoff, where the cutoff is this sum function of the amplitude of the input, R, the dynamics of the muscle, M, the neural dynamics of the cerebrocerebellar circuit, K, feedback, gain, and then Q, the neural dynamics of the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord. Okay? So she gets that formula. Okay, and she shows that if omega is greater than this cutoff frequency, then there exist initial conditions in these boxes as well as a phase shift that will generate the skip cycles. Okay, so that was her result. So now getting to your question about the sensitivity of omega C to all these different parameters. So what she can do now is she can say, okay, let me fix all the parameters and just vary one at a time and see what happens to this cutoff. Okay, so that way she does a sensitivity analysis. But before I show that analysis, just want to say the one way to sort of view what alpha motor neurons or neurons do in general is they're doing some type of non-uniform sampling of signals, right? They're spike trains, and they're sort of sampling these stimuli, these inputs, and in a non-uniform way. And conceptually, when the frequency increases, if you don't spike fast enough, you're going to miss many peaks and values, right? But you don't miss all of them because you do have some muscle, some brain, and you're going to catch some of them, right? And so the M and the K and the F bring you back to generate at least some amount of tracking, okay? Yeah. Right. 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 Right.
The question is that I think under the radar,
Right.